It's not very often that I'm shown something in one of the ad interfaces that I've never seen before. Even for this channel, I've gotten in the habit of just clicking around in the interface, and anything that's cool, we put together a video for it. But that's exactly what happened a few weeks ago. I was doing a screen share with a colleague. She was going through Facebook ads and went into a section that I had kind of seen before, but never really paid attention to. That's the Facebook Inspect tab. And to be honest, I was really pleasantly surprised at the information that was in there, and I think it's really useful. So today, I'm going to run through the Facebook Inspect tab. I'm going to show you where it is, the charts that are available, and how you can start to use them to make better decisions for your campaigns. When we hop into a Facebook ads account, there's a pretty specific place that we can find the Inspect tab. First, you'll notice that I'm already on the Ad Sets tab, and I've chosen a couple of campaigns that we're going to run through today. This is because campaigns and ads tabs do not have the Inspect tab option. This only lives at the ad set within Facebook, so you can't inspect anything at the campaign or ad level. To get to the Inspect tool, there are a couple of different ways you can do it. Off to the right, you'll see this gray bar over here, and this is what's going to show up when you go in and click into the editor function or see change history, and you can see those icons here. This top one is to see the charts, next one is to edit, this is the change history, and this little tiny magnifying glass with what looks like little bar chart in it, this is the Inspect tool. As you can see here, we would need to select an ad set to inspect it, which effectively means we need to check the box next to a single ad set. But there is a second option of how we can do this. If I come over here and hover over the ad set name, you'll see the same options down below. We have Inspect, View Charts, Edit, and Duplicate. And this is the way I'm going to get into the Inspect tab first. So this is how you get to the Inspect tool for a single ad set. You're not able to select multiple ad sets and use the Inspect tool. If I check the box next to a second one over here, everything in this area will go away because you have to have only one single ad set selected to inspect it. So I'm going to uncheck this box. And then just as a programming note, for the rest of this video, I'm going to be going through two ad sets in two different accounts because there are going to be some sections where there's data for one account but not the other, and vice versa. So if you notice over the course of the video that the performance trends are a little bit different or that the stats changed, that's because I jumped accounts, because I want to make sure that we've got data in each of the charts so I can show you an example of how it works. With that precursor, I'm going to go ahead and jump into a different account to get started on the first chart. I've gone ahead and expanded the view, which you can do by clicking the arrow over here. Right now it says collapse view because I've expanded it, but when this chart is a little bit further over like it was in the last view, the arrow will point the other way and it'll say expand view. So basically that's what I've done for this to take up the entire screen if you were wanting to see how that worked. The first chart up here at the top is going to be effectively just a trending chart of a number of different stats, and those stats are going to be cost per purchase, purchases, amount spent, reach, first time impression ratio, and auction overlap rate. And a number of these stats are going to show up in some of the other charts below, but I wanted to use this account to show you the first chart because it has data for it, but it also has some of the formatting that I want to walk through first. So you'll notice that there are two lines already on this chart. There is this teal, green, blue type of color, which is the cost per purchase, and then there's the more purple, maroon type of color for purchases, and that shows you each day's trend of performance. But then you'll also notice that there are some yellow blocks in here with different icons at the top of it. So the first thing I want to do is talk about how you can read the charts, because the formatting is going to be the same for the rest of the charts down the Inspect tab. So first let's come all the way over here to this key off to the right where it says chart areas. Because you'll see here that there is one that has the yellow lines on it, which is going to be the same as you can see here. There's another one that's going to be dark yellow, which kind of is going to go in line with these lines here. And then there's a gray one that's going to basically say data is not available. So the first one is learning phase. Anytime you see a chart in here that has this yellow slanted line across it for a certain period of time, that means that on that day, this ad set was still in the learning phase. You had made an edit, and Facebook was still trying to learn. That brings us to the next line that's over here. This dark yellow line shows that there was a significant edit. So here, every time there's a line that goes down, you can see that there was a significant edit. And this is when it kicked it off into the learning phase right here. You'll see that for a while there were no significant edits with this one, and that's why it eventually came out of the learning phase and the chart was just white. But then we had the first significant edit over here that threw it back into the learning phase as well. You may have noticed that when I hovered over one of those lines, it will open up and show you an overview at a pretty high level what the significant edits were for this ad set that threw it back into the learning phase or that made any individual changes on the campaigns. So this is kind of trying to give you some indicator as to why the ad set was thrown back into the learning phase. And at any point, if you want more detail about what the changes were, you can always hop back over here to the change history to see what happened on those dates. And there is a bit of a cheat for that I'll show you here in just a little bit, but to be quite honest, that's at the bottom of this page and we're not there yet. So let's stick with the chart that we're in. We already talked about the two lines for cost per purchase and purchases, but again, there are 4 other metrics that are in this chart as well. If we want to add any specific number, all we have to do is come over, click on the name, and a new line will be added to the chart. You'll see that the axis guides went away because now we have 2 different metrics that are cost, and now they're being plotted relative to each other, but we can't have the same axis labels because it's going to be way too far out of whack. So if I take amount spent off, those chart labels on the left and the right will come back. But the more lines that we add in, we lose those metrics. And unfortunately, each time we add one of these in, it gets a little bit harder and harder to read. But you can see that you can chart each one of these metrics, and you can eventually have this specific table show you pretty much any metric combination that you want. If you think that purchases versus amount spent is more meaningful, great. If you want to see reach just by itself, you can do that as well. It's really easy to customize this chart and see what the performance was for each of those individual metrics. The second chart that we have down here is around bid strategy. The goal of this chart is to show you the relationship between your bid strategy and your ongoing cost per result over time. Effectively, you're trying to determine if any rising costs are related to your bid strategy, and it's trying to plot what your bid strategy is versus performance over time, so you can understand the trade-offs between the bid strategies that you have in place. So the reason that I chose this ad set within this account is because this one utilizes cost control. One thing to note, this ad set utilizes cost control. This is where we're trying to keep a certain cost per purchase in mind. And right now you can see that our cost control was at $55 cost per purchase, and overall performance was at $43.27. Here you'll notice that we have the blue line that shows the overall cost per purchase. As performance was trending, it goes up, comes back down, typically stays under the dotted line, which is the cost per purchase target that we had in place, or the cost control at $55. So it does show you your cost per purchase relative to what your bid strategy was by demarking your bid strategy cost cap with that dotted line. Now I mentioned I chose this specific account for a reason. Let me hop back into the other account that I'll be utilizing for other charts to show you why. This is the second account that I'm going to use for some other charts down below. You'll notice here that the bid strategy section just has some text and there's no chart eligible. It says the lowest cost bid strategy provides no direct control over costs. Costs may rise over time as cheaper opportunities are exhausted or budget is increased. So long story short, if you're utilizing the default lowest cost bid strategy, like most of my campaigns are, and my guess is that most of your campaigns are, this bid strategy section is going to probably be blank. There's not going to be anything that you can run with. Don't fret if you don't see any data here. It's probably just because you're utilizing lowest cost bid strategy. For the next few charts, I'm going to stick with this account because it has data that the other one doesn't. So the next chart is going to be auction competition. I'm going to scroll up a little bit so we can see this a little bit better. But effectively what this is trying to do is tell you if the competition in the auction is the reason for any potential rising costs. The way you read this chart is that it uses a percentage to track auction competition. It says, for example, a data point of 5% means that competition for that day is 5% higher than the average for your selected time period. It does go on to say that anything between 20% and negative 20% should be considered stable or normal within the Facebook auction. So effectively what we're trying to do with this chart is to say, if I'm seeing rising costs for my campaign, is that due to competition or is there something else going on? Let's look at the data for this audience specifically. And you can see here that the auction competition is going to be this robin egg blue color, and cost per lead is unfortunately only a slightly different color, so hopefully most of you out there are able to differentiate the two. But you can see that we have a slightly rising cost per purchase as we get here into June, kind of the 23rd into the 26th, around in there. And there is a little bit of an increase in competition, not on this first day. That's still down at negative about 9%, and cost per lead is about normal at about $50. But then we have an increase of about 5%. Cost per lead goes up to $151, which is not really proportional only to a 5% increase. But then cost per lead is still high at 100. Auction competition is upwards of 16% more competitive that day. And then the next day, cost per lead is at 148, and auction competition is up 13% on average compared to normal days. We then have another day where it's still up 9%, but cost per lead jumps way back down to 43%. And then it has some fluctuating performance as time goes on. The biggest takeaway I have from looking at this chart is that we had some bad days toward the end of June. We've had one not so great day kind of in the middle of the beginning of July, around July 6th, and there have been some other fluctuant performance. But overall, competition is within the normal range of that 20 to negative 20%. I would take away from here that we might have seen a little bit of an influx toward the end of June that could be having a bit of an impact, but on average, things are relatively stable in terms of competition. It's probably something else going on of why we had lower days. Maybe this is when our audience was taking a holiday. Maybe we changed something on the landing page. Seems like there's an external factor or two playing into why those days didn't perform as well. Competition is not necessarily the main culprit, but it could be playing a factor for those specific days. One other thing that I want to call out while we're looking at this chart is that you might think, maybe you made a significant edit during this time period that threw the campaign back into the learning phase. You'll notice none of that formatting is eligible in this campaign because we did not make any significant edits during this time period. All of the yellow bars and the yellow lines that you saw in the previous account are not here, not because that formatting isn't working, but because there were no significant edits. So if all your charts look white like this, that means that any change you made during the time period that you're reviewing performance for, there were no significant edits and the campaign was not in the learning phase. So I just want to call that out as well for anybody who might be thinking maybe the learning phase is why performance wasn't as good for those days. That would not be the case here because there was no learning phase. The next section down is audience saturation. And this, I think, is really helpful to see how you're reaching your audience. And there are a few different stats that we have eligible in here. We have the frequency, which is going to count how many times over the lifetime that this ad has been running that an individual user has seen it. We have first time impression ratio, which is going to say the number of impressions that are for the people who are seeing it for the first time. There's also reach, which is also a lifetime stat, which just counts the number of people who have seen your ad. And then one of my favorite metrics to check in on from time to time is audience reached ratio. And that means that it is going to be the amount of the target audience that you have reached based on the estimate Facebook gives you in the audience creation section. So I'm not going to do it right now, but if I were to hop back into this edit function for this ad set, it would tell me that there are 24 million users within this estimated audience size, and we can take the 4.72% mark down here to know that we have reached almost 5% of that 24 million user set. So that tells me that we have not overstayed our welcome completely in this audience. There's still plenty to reach out into. Even if we start to notice that frequency might be getting a little bit higher than we would like, there's still plenty of ways that we can reach new members within the target audience that we have. As you review each of these different metrics, you'll notice that the cost per lead stat stays in place, but that the only thing that changes will be that frequency will change to audience reached ratio. Facebook is going to leave the cost per lead metric so you can compare what your costs have been over time to each of these individual metrics. So you can see here that we've gone from about a 4.2, maybe in the high 4.1s, all the way up to 4.72 in audience reach ratio. The reach line is going to look relatively similar. Went from about 1 million to 1.1 million over time. That's pretty much always going to linearly increase because we're always reaching new users. And then we also have the first time impression ratio, which is going to bounce back and forth depending on how many times you've reached a new user. And we do see a little bit of an increase in new user ratio during that time where we had higher costs. But again, it's still mostly in line line with what the first time impression ratio has been on average. So I wouldn't necessarily say that that was the cause of those rising costs during that late June period either. Overall, this section is really useful to help you determine if you're starting to see declining results. You can try and rule out the idea of saturating the audience if all stats in here look normal. I would say if we started to see continual declining performance from this audience as opposed to just a couple of days that aren't as good, I would look here to see if we're oversaturating the audience. In these metrics that are here, I would not conclude that. I think we're doing just fine. The frequency might be a little bit higher than I'd like, but overall, it's really not that bad. So if we're seeing declining performance and audience saturation is low, like this account would be, there's probably some other factor playing into it, whether it's ad fatigue, or again, going back to the idea that we made external changes on the landing page, something along those lines. But if we do see that audience saturation has increased, or if that we're trending toward a more dangerous level, it could be time to switch out audiences, expand an audience, and try and make sure that we get some new eyes in that group so that we're not continually reaching out to the same people who aren't going to convert. The next chart is the last performance chart that we can see within the campaign here, and it's going to be around auction overlap. And that's going to show you how often your ad set ended up in the same auction as another from the same account. So this isn't going to compare just within a campaign, it's going to compare across your entire account. To prevent you from bidding against yourself, Facebook removes the less competitive ad set from the auction. So what you're trying to determine is whether any under delivery may be related to auction overlap. So if you notice that one ad set isn't delivering as much as you want, you're not spending your full budget, something along those lines, it could be because your audience is overlapping too much with other audiences in your account, and this one is simply losing out. So what you can do is you can review this chart to see if your auction overlap rate is too high. One thing I do want to point out is that auction overlap rate is different from audience overlap rate. Auction overlap rate refers to the number of times that your audiences were in direct competition in the auctions with each other. We have a video that shows you how to use the audience overlap tool, and that is something you would want to use basically before you get to this stage to make sure that your audiences don't overlap. But they are different. Just because your audiences overlap doesn't necessarily mean that your auctions will overlap as well. It's a pretty darn good indicator that they will, so I will refer you to some of the guidelines that we had in that audience overlap video, but this is going to be different from that metric, and you'll notice that the percentages are probably going to be a lot lower than what you would see in that audience overlap tool in a lot of examples that you put together. For this account specifically, this audience was in the same auction. It had an overlap rate of 3.59% with other audiences within the account. Overall, that's relatively low. That's not too terribly concerning for me. I have seen some accounts that have very high percentages where audiences overlap quite a bit. Tends to happen a lot when people don't set up their retargeting to have certain audiences excluded if they're trying to have multiple different layers, or if you're trying to target the same user through a number of different interests and you have all of your ad sets broken out very granularly. These people might overlap and they might end up being in the same auction. When you have auction overlap data, there is an option down here to show additional insights, and down here you can see the top overlapping ad sets for that same period. So there are 3 audiences here. I'm sorry that the names are going to be blurred out, but basically the top one has a 1.17 overlap rate, the second one is 1.03, and the third one is down just over 0.5% overlap rate. So overall, this 3.59 is not just compared to a single other audience, it's for all audiences within the account, and you can start to determine which audiences of yours have too much in common with other ones, and maybe you want to start to narrow those down, group them into the same ad set to help lower CPMs, reduce this overlap rate, and stop bidding against yourself. The last section within the inspect tool is going to be the significant edit history. And like I talked about earlier, this specific ad set had no significant edit history during this time period. We've really been trying to minimize the learning phase for this account because it's been hit extra hard every time it goes back into the learning phase. So let's hop back into that other account that we looked at earlier to see how this looks. Effectively, it's going to be formatted pretty similar to the change history section within Facebook ads. You'll be able to see the specific activity, the activity details, who it was changed by, and the date and time. So each time you're reading one of these charts, I'm just going to look at the auction overlap report here, and you'll see why I looked at the other account for that, because there's no auction overlap for this audience. But here we'll see that there is significant edit history. So we can see that there's a change here on January 4th. There was another one on the 7th, and there are going to be some other ones down here on the 21st, 25th, 29th. And you'll see here that the 29th, those are going to be the line items that are up here up at the top. If you are reading each of these individual charts, whether it's from the auction overlap tool, the audience saturation, or even just the performance trends at the beginning, you should be able to hover over the icon here. And although it says view details, I've come to find that if you click on that, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't take you anywhere. So unfortunately, if you want more information on what ad was updated on January 29th, you can come down into the significant edit history log all the way down at the bottom of the inspect tab and get more information by hovering over the little eye icon next to that ad change line item. Overall, the Facebook Inspect tab was a real surprise to me. I've really come to value the data that is in here. There's a lot that you can see in a very quick manner, and I find that the formatting is really easy to see performance trends versus the learning phase when we've made significant edits, and try and map a number of different stats against each other to understand how performance is trending without having to do really big reports to get any information. And then on top of that, it's pretty awesome that there's a quick way to check and see if competition is going up or down, if you're competing against yourself, and if you're oversaturating your audience in a short period of time. That data is invaluable on Facebook, and it's super important when it comes to optimizing your campaigns. So hopefully you are just as impressed with this Inspect tab as I was, and this overview is going to help you make a lot better decisions in your Facebook ads accounts. Thanks for watching our video. If you thought it was useful, give us a thumbs up below.
We release a new video at least once a week, so if you want to get notified of when a new one comes out, be sure to subscribe to the Paid Media Pros channel.